How's an ordinary American supposed to figure out what to think about a COVID surge that is broader, but also way milder than any previous version, yet seems to be triggering some pretty dramatic reactions? And why did the Supreme Court take up President Biden's vaccine mandate case last week without yet delivering a decision? What does it all mean for schools getting back in session? And speaking of President Biden, will the political demise of his multiple trillion-dollar Build Back Better plan save us all from monster inflation? We'll discuss all of this and more in today's episode of Independent Outlook. Greetings, everybody. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you from the Independent Institute here in Oakland, California. We're just across the bay from San Francisco. We try and bring you some analysis of the events of the day from a perspective that is independent of, shall we say, dominant political trends and fashions. And to help us in this conversation today, I'm joined by my two colleagues, as is customary. So grateful to have David Theroux with us. David is the founder and president of the Independent Institute. Hello, David.
Hi, Graham. Great to be here.
Great to see you. Great to have all of our friends with us. Also, for the conversation, we also have our other longtime collaborator, Williamson Evers. Bill Evers, welcome.
Thank you.
Bill is the director of our Center on Educational Excellence and a very noteworthy scholar of all things education and public policy more generally. So, gentlemen, we have taken a little break during the holiday season, but here we are back together and with our friends from around the country. So glad to have you all with us. There's a lot to talk about. Yeah, and Happy New Year to everybody. Exactly, for sure. But there's a lot to talk about. I want to talk about COVID first. If you don't mind. I noticed the other day that the New York Times is telling us that the data is telling a consistent story. I'm reading from a Times report. Omicron is significantly milder. And the New York Times says there's less hospitalization, milder hospitalization, fewer deaths. It was a pretty important distinction between the Omicron surge, which is mild but broad, and the earlier surges. And yet, just to get on the table this thought here, which is that California, for example, I'm afraid maybe a little more than some states, but not atypical. California is kind of going out on a limb. There's a shortage of workers, partly because of Omicron, keeping people home, but also partly because there have been these requirements that unvaccinated healthcare workers should not report to work. But now there's a new mandate coming down from the California Department of Public Health saying that even COVID positive healthcare workers, if they're vaccinated but asymptomatic, can be forced to come to work to deal with the healthcare shortage. So my head is spinning. I'm going to turn to David first here, but my head is spinning. So first, they tell them that they can't work because they're not vaccinated. But if they are vaccinated and they get sick anyway, then they have to come to work if they're asymptomatic. But we know if they're asymptomatic, even if they're vaccinated, they can be spewing the virus. So what's going on here, David?
Well, it's even more complicated and confusing because we know that the vaccinations have virtually no effect on the Omicron variant. So it doesn't really matter if you've been vaccinated or not, you're susceptible to it just the same. We know quite a bit more now. We also know that the more times you are vaccinated, the more likely you are to get COVID now, because your immune system has been compromised. And so, the idea you're going to have a booster every 6 months, 4 months, 1 month, week, whatever, is a fool's errand. So the bigger picture that should give us hope is that the Omicron variant, which is basically similar to a head cold, it can also create natural immunity. And since this is a variant that is very contagious, the possibility of the population reaching herd immunity is quite high, as long as the government doesn't keep locking people up and essentially create an incentive, so to speak, for another variant. But the likelihood of the Omicron variant being sort of a Christmas present is high. Mm-hmm. I think most scientists agree with that. And it's good news. So in California and New York and elsewhere where they're locking down people again, or talking about it seriously, or threatening to penalize people who are not vaccinated as far as being able to work or to go to restaurants or whatever, is really completely misguided, and it's not based on the science.
So I have to qualify David's generally sound remarks, and that I'm not sure I'm in agreement with him that having these shots and boosters is reducing your immunity. I think that's a quite disputed thing, but there's no reason to dwell on it. I mean, it's clearly not blocking people from getting the Omicron variant.
Yeah, certainly not. I mean, what's a little confusing, of course, is that for any individual, you can imagine under certain circumstances, if you have pre-existing conditions or you're a certain age or whatever, there might be a real advantage to you to getting the vaccine. But at the same time,
speaking for the over 70 crowd, yes.
Yes.
By the way, we should mention one thing about the vaccines. The vaccines are not the same idea. In fact, the definition of vaccine is that you're inoculated with a version of the virus. And
so these are different because they're tackling the spikes.
So technically, it's not a vaccine. And the whatever we want to call them, let's call them vaccines for the time being, are simply untested. The vaccine that is legal in the United States is a vaccine that you can't get in the United States. And David,
that's somewhat confusing. And
it is confusing.
Certainly,
the FDA did not approve the vaccine that's available in the US. They approved another vaccine, which is not even available. It was basically a con job. And I think that's widely known now.
It's not widely known to me.
Well, it's widely known among people who are epidemiologists who practice in the field.
I'm willing to accept that the testing of the vaccine was imperfect. For example, they didn't really test a lot of older people. They didn't really test a lot of people that were having lots of comorbidities. Those are the most vulnerable people. But now we have lots of experience with it.
We have lots of experience, but part of it, as I was going to get to, is that if the vaccine is so effective, why is there no liability for side effects or damaging results? In fact, most of the institutions were pressured not even to keep track of side effects.
I certainly agree that we want to have liability for things, right, certain things, but I also think I can't really buy the idea that the vaccine is killing more people than COVID-19.
And
that was the Kathy Hochul announcement, right?
That was her announcement.
I don't trust her on much of anything.
Cuomo knew it too and wouldn't release it.
Let's
become even more evident.
But the data on this is derived from self-reporting, not from medically scrutinized, scientifically scrutinized data. So I'm just not going to.
It's the only data that exists, Bill.
Okay, but it's no good.
Well, then what data are you using to make your claim?
I'm just saying no good data is no good data.
It is data that is more accurate than what we had before, because before the number of people who were being, one of the things that the governor of New York admitted,
it has to go through some kind of scientific review. Yeah. It can't just be self-reporting, right, and then you take it raw and don't analyze it. So I think we should drop the topic.
Well, let me just make one more point. The other point I was going to make is that the reporting of the Omicron was played down as far as it's being mild. And the number of people, this is probably the most startling thing that the government admitted, is that the number of people who are listed as dying of COVID or hospitalized as COVID was radically exaggerated.
They have admitted that, and I think it's very good that they have, because it's different to die from COVID and die with COVID. In other words,
exactly. Right.
the typical great example is the guy's in an automobile accident and he's basically killed by the automobile accident. So then they test him and he has, COVID or asymptomatic COVID or something like that. And they list partly because of bounties for that in hospital reimbursements and and so forth.
Right.
But for any number of reasons, they're listing it as a COVID death. So
and the same thing is true with children too.
Right. Exactly.
So children hospitalizations or just children who are
almost
tested.
all. That's right.
Right. So children who are tested
are not necessarily sick with COVID.
Right.
They may
no
have
symptoms
COVID.
Whatsoever.
Exactly. So that I think is it's a good thing that that's coming out and that even Fauci is acknowledging that. So I think that's a much more clear-eyed portrait of the whole situation. And I think David's absolutely correct to say that there was exaggeration that accompanied the announcements about Omicron, and that there's panic. And we can most easily see this in the whole school situation. But obviously, the California policies are another symptom of this. And, they need to calm down and they need to concentrate again on the elderly, the people with comorbidities.
Right.
And the rest of the people should be going about their normal business. And if you have the disease, you should stay home and your family should stay home.
The other thing that's come out just in the last few days was the release of documents that Project Veritas uncovered,
right?
Military documents,
right,
which essentially showed the correspondence by Fauci and others, which is a complete disgrace, and it shows the corruption within these agencies.
That's part of the dispute between Dr. Fauci and Senator Rand Paul.
Well, not just Senator Rand Paul, it's also with Senator, he was just on yesterday.
Tom Cotton was also.
That's right. Well, Cotton, but there's another one. Anyway, the point is that this is becoming more accepted in mainstream circles, and Fauci continues to deny it, even though the documents are clear. It's emails to him, it's emails from him. And the basic story for those who don't know it was that the EcoHealth Alliance, DARSAC, wanted to do research to be funded by DARPA, from the Department of Defense. And the department turned it down because they believed they would not have the right security and safety precautions because it's just too dangerous.
Right. But
Fauci didn't care. And so the point that Senator Rand Paul and others have been making is that Fauci had this long-term relationship with the Wuhan lab. So they put it there secretly and have tried to cover it up. And if it was too dangerous for the bioweapons program of the Department of Defense, why is NIH involved in it?
Good question.
The reason is because
they have some money.
Well, it's not just that. It's because NIH and the history of the CDC itself is one of developing bioweapon grade materials in different ways. And there's a whole history of that too, which is another story.
So there's also emerging, this is by no means shown to be a valid report, but there's news of a possible military analysis of what was actually going on, that they may have been trying to inoculate bats in order to make the bats less dangerous to humans. But that there was a slip between cup and lip, and the virus emerged into human society. So this isn't confirmed yet. I and my research associate looked all over the internet today to try to find out if this has been verified, but it's still just reported. We don't know whether the document that's come out is really a real one or not. But if it is, it helps explain anyway what the Wuhan people were probably doing.
Also, one of the side aspects of this is, we've discussed this before, the article the letter essentially published in the Lancet journal that was basically organized by Darsak, signed by 17 scientists. Many of those scientists have since changed their mind.
That is true.
And they no longer either believe the wet market source or any other animal source, but that it really most likely came from a lab, probably the Wuhan lab, or at least it needs to be looked into and not just dismissed, was what Darsak tried to do.
I strongly recommend Matt Ridley's book, Viral, on this. It's extremely fair-minded discussion of both the lab leak and natural transmission theories of origins, and it's very readable. There's one co-author is a top scientist, and the other is this great science writer. So I think the thing also that's going on in terms of the conflict between Senator Rand Paul and Dr. Anthony Fauci is Fauci and Collins, his boss, tried to organize attacks on the Great Barrington focused prevention approach. That
focused
is
protection.
Yeah. And just wanted to label it as fringe and so forth.
Right.
And Rand Paul has been saying, look, these are prominent scientists from Stanford and Oxford and Harvard. You shouldn't have been trying to shut them down. And obviously, Rand Paul also thinks they were right. They were correct. And I think the three of us also think they were
for sure
likely correct. So anyway, I think we should move on to some other horrifying.
Well, there are other angles. There are some other angles on the same topic.
Well, yeah, we do need to get to the Supreme Court thing a little bit.
Yeah,
too,
yeah. So. David, you're about to toss one more thing there.
Well, I was going to say the segue, following on what Bill just said, is COVID and the policies of non-medical criteria for treatment of patients.
Oh, yes.
In New York City and New York and other places.
This is a very, very
essentially taking critical race theory and applying it to medicine, completely contrary to the Hippocratic Oath, and to do no harm and to do whatever you can for that individual patient. Instead, you're rationing care based on race and whatever other criteria. Now, of course, this raises a particularly damning point about government being involved in healthcare, period.
Yeah, I'm wondering, why is the government distributing the stuff in the first place?
Right. So if you have competitive markets in healthcare, you have innovation, you have practitioners and so forth based on care on a voluntary basis. You have innovation, you have markets, you have all the rest of it. And the price of things drops because of the competition, because of the innovations. But if you eliminate price criteria as the way to make decisions and also the Hippocratic Oath, you're left with other ways of rationing healthcare.
Right.
And those other ways are really, in my opinion, immoral and can't be based on the science. I mean, for example, one argument that's been made that in many of these instances that the allocation of different kinds of remedies should be done based on race, Hispanic, Blacks, what have you, is the argument that they're essentially from a disparity position, getting the short end of the stick, and we need to equalize things. But if you have to look at the data, I think it was it's like 35% of Blacks have been inoculated compared to whites.
So it's interesting that progressives are being very deprecatory, very harsh, very mean toward the unvaccinated.
Yes. But
it turns out that a substantial portion of the unvaccinated are Latinos and Blacks.
Right.
So in their administering of treatments and tests and things like this, they want to be biased, deliberately, explicitly biased in favor of the people
Right.
on the other hand, they're attacking. So they're caught in a crazy position here.
Right. So as far as ethnic groups are concerned, the highest percentage group to be vaccinated are Asians. And the lowest percentage is Blacks. And
that's their choice. That's their choice. But then they shouldn't be rewarded for that, in my opinion.
Right, exactly.
They should just be treated neutrally.
Being penalized. So if the point is that the unvaccinated are the threat, this goes against that. But also, take the side of Blacks, whose history includes
Tuskegee syphilis experiments.
Exactly, and other examples of eugenics-based approaches that were done either secretly or in a compulsory way, which were incredibly harmful.
So it's not surprising that there's some vaccine hesitancy there.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, I think we should go to the Supreme Court.
Let's go. Yeah.
Oh.
I mean, so the court on Friday, just a few days ago, had a 4-hour session where the case was brought to them on these two mandates coming down from the federal government, the Biden administration. One was imposing a vaccine mandate for workers in health facilities, at least insofar as health facilities receive federal funds, which is the vast majority of them. And the other is a more general mandate from OSHA requiring a vaccine or test protocol for all private employers of 100 or more workers.
Right.
And so this was a pretty important discussion. Apparently, the Biden administration believes that these mandates, insisting that healthcare workers get these vaccines and then insisting that employees of larger companies get vaccines, that this would solve the problem better or be a big help toward improving the epidemic or something, I guess. But the court has actually not yet issued its decision on the matter. So these two mandates are actually moving ahead, at least where they can. In 25 states, the private employer mandate is being implemented even as we speak, or at least all the employers are wondering what to do because the court hasn't issued a final ruling. My guess is that there's a lot of behind the door arguing going on at the Supreme Court right now, and they're trying to decide how they're going to issue a decision. But based on what happened on Friday in the courtroom, it was pretty clear that those supporting these federal mandates had a pretty constitutionally dubious case. I mean, for example,
it's constitutionally dubious; it's scientifically dubious,
and it's also statutorily dubious. I mean, the OSHA law, which we're not really here to defend, but anyway, the law that was passed has to do with things like equipment, okay, and space around you to be safe and things like that. It's not a public health measure. Public health, again, we're not necessarily saying that state and local governments handle this wisely, but in terms of government measures, that is under our Constitution, a state and local matter, not a federal matter. And they're trying to shoehorn it into something that has to do with, dangerous weaving looms and things like that, assembly lines. And so the court is rightfully skeptical. Now, they're not as skeptical about federally funded healthcare workers. And I think for the three of us, and larger sort of thing is, how moot is this, given that the vaccines are not stopping the spread?
They're not. And the level of vaccination has reached a pretty high percentage anyways without the mandates coming from the federal government.
Yeah, it's about 70% of Americans have had at least one vaccination.
And when it comes to the highly vulnerable population, it's in the 90s.
Yes.
Right.
And
but so what was amazing.
Go ahead, Greg.
Well, what was amazing to me was that the reaction of some of the justices was fascinating. For example,
their ignorance.
Yeah. We'll come to that in a minute, but I'm looking at this report from NPR that I was following here. And Justice Elena Kagan, it was reported, noted that nearly 1 million people have died. It's by far the greatest public health danger the country has faced. And this is the policy that is most geared to stopping this. Okay, now.
And she also claimed there were tons of children on ventilators.
That was Sotomayor.
That was
Justice
Sotomayor.
Yeah.
I'm on Kagan right now. We'll come to Sotomayor in a second.
Sorry.
But regarding Kagan, so her argument, at least the part that's being reported here is the lead argument that she was making, or implication of her statements and so forth, is that this policy is going to stop all this. So there must be a way to justify the federal government imposing the mandate, because this is the desired result.
Yes.
Right. Very result oriented.
And not at all attentive to the role of a judge, which should be, first of all, jurisdictional.
Well, it's positive law in a perfect sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
But she really ought to be asking, as the others were doing,
Well, part of the
does
view,
the federal government have the authority to issue this kind of mandate or not?
part of the view is the view that Fauci, who represents essentially the mainstream public health viewpoint, is that if you have an infection or a pandemic or an epidemic, the solution is to have universal vaccination.
Right.
And the point I've been making, that Robert Malone and others have been making, is that if you push for universal vaccination, you actually create incentives for the virus to mutate into more potent forms.
Right. That's what's scary about
So
it.
the recommendation
there you
that
have a good point.
Scott Atlas and others have been making, people behind the Great Barrington Declaration and so on, is that, as Bill said, you focus on those who are most at risk. Now, it may be vaccinations, it may be therapeutics, it may be there are other things that people are taking which have a track record. But the point is that this one-size-fits-all view is not based on the science, and it is dangerous. And so the ignorance
agree.
of the Supreme, the liberal members, essentially justices, that which was voiced by Kagan, Sotomayor, and Breyer, shows they don't know what they're talking about as far as the science of it, and they're just acting as true progressives, believing in the conventional narrative.
From a constitutional point of view, there's this other dimension of it, though, too. I agree with you about the facts and the danger of excessive mass vaccination and so forth. But even if it were true that, quoting Elena Kagan, this is the policy that is most geared to stopping this, even if that were true, which it isn't true, but even if it were true, it doesn't follow that the federal government has the power that claimed to issue and the mindset of Justice Kagan and the other two on that wing of the court, to me, is so revealing in this case, because for their point of view, once you decide on the desired and beneficent outcome, even if mistakenly, but if that's what you think, then you just look for some rationalization to justify the federal government issuing these mandates. It makes constitutional law into an exercise in rationalization of power. And that, to me, is quite scary from a constitutional point of view.
And the default is always to centralize power.
Always, yeah. It's always to centralize power.
Right.
So we've got some other things to say about this justice.
Okay.
Well, about Justice Sotomayor, she got, it's worth mentioning, she got kind of roasted afterwards for having made the comment that there were 100,000 children in serious condition, many of them on ventilators. Well, it turns out even Rochelle Walensky, the director of the CDC, had to make a public statement and say, well, it's about 3,500 children in hospital with COVID, not 100,000.
Yeah, but again, it's with COVID, not because of COVID.
Well, right. So in other words, it's even less.
Right.
So the 100,000 number, which Justice Sotomayor came up with out of the air, I guess.
It's not coronavirus that's brought them into the hospital.
A few of them, probably.
Yeah, small number. But it's virtually,
and they're not on ventilators. We now know that you don't do ventilators until very much in extremis.
Right.
And
then Breyer, getting back to my point, was basically voicing the Fauci view that we want to have 100% vaccination, and that will only 100% vaccination will create 100% or some large percentage of herd immunity, and it's simply not true.
Right.
It's not
So
based on the science.
This whole thing is problematic, both factually and is problematic constitutionally. And I do suspect that the 6 members of the court who expressed skepticism about these federal mandates very likely will agree to issue some kind of a ruling, at least
The question is whether they can do it timely.
I know, exactly. Yeah,
That's
you
right.
really wonder whether they'll be able to do. And employers everywhere, they're pulling their hair out. They don't know what.
Well, some of them are, preemptively requiring it.
Right.
So
It seems like
I think we should hope good sense prevails, and I think we should turn to the schools, because that's a place where good sense is not prevailed.
Yeah, tell us, okay, how is this hitting the schools, and are the schools able to open properly? Bill?
Well, they haven't really. The teachers and the unions that are the vehicle for teachers' worries, and so think of the teachers' unions as an interest group that is organized mainly to push for more money and greater, better, more friendly working conditions for teachers. And it's a membership organization, and it attempts to cartelize the market and block additional entrants from coming easy, people substituting for teachers that in a way that somehow competes against their high salary. So they
you have a low opinion of teachers unions. I can tell.
No, it's not low. That's just like
it's realistic,
straightforward realism about what they do.
That's right.
So by the way, they, the big man who such created the American Federation of Teachers from New York, Albert Shanker, said, hey, we'll start worrying about the children when the children start paying dues, when they start paying dues. So they're frank about this in candid moments. Mm-hmm. So anyway, the problem is that many teachers were panicked by this. Many teachers were not really looking at the best science on this. It is complicated to try and figure it out, but they just decided to leverage their power to close down the schools and not even really go over to virtual learning. They're just not working. And so Chicago was the most famous case of this. They're now returning after an unauthorized strike, and the city is not willing to pay them for the days they took off. They may somehow wangle that back somehow. In San Francisco, they had a sick out, over 1 million children. So there's 50 million children in schools. Over 1 million children were out in January, which we're just into now, because of these sorts of work stoppages and lockdowns and cities saying there's not enough people here, and so we have to close down and so forth. That's a lot of people. And the front page of the New York Times on Sunday New York Times, the lead story was about how the Democrats are terrified of parental reaction to this, that the Democrats are wrapped up in the teachers' unions. They supply much of their walking force. They supply a lot of money. They are the dominant interest group at Democratic national conventions. The teachers' union endorsement is make or break for candidates for president and for many other offices. In most states, the teachers' union is the single most important political group. And so here they are, wrapped up with the teachers' union inextricably, and the parents are furious. And Democrats are very afraid of a repeat of Virginia at state, local, and national level. And, it's kind of looking like that might happen. So they don't really know what to do. You can see the mayor of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot, who is a left-wing Democrat, attacking the teachers' unions for this.
That was a new phenomenon.
Yeah.
You can see the president and his minions more or less begging. They're not denouncing. But they're imploring the teachers. Even Randy Weingarten is trying to thread the needle somehow here, being both for the teachers in their panic and recognizing the political reality. If this goes on too much, it's going to be a terrible political reaction. So that's a fascinating thing. The lighter side of this, in Arlington, Virginia, teachers union didn't want to go back to work. So they wrote a completely terrible, issued a terrible statement. It was bad writing. It was poor usage. It was spelling, grammar, punctuation mistakes.
Oh, that's embarrassing for teachers.
You know, it's the typical thing. It's like having a school district and you look at the opening page and there's some kind of spelling or grammatical error. This had scores of errors in it. Yeah. And of course it went viral. So that's the lighter side, but it's horrifying to think that the people doing this are the people teaching our children.
Well, another aspect of this, which is a positive side, is the growth of homeschooling and other schooling alternatives.
It's been a great year for charter schools, for vouchers, and for homeschooling.
Homeschooling, I think, has increased. You can correct me about this. I think it was before something like 2 to 3% of children were homeschooled. Is now, I think it's slightly over 11%. Is that right? And of course, some states, in fact, some of the blue states, including New York and others, are higher. And so it's growing. It's growing pretty quickly. And I'll plug this book behind me, Really Good Schools by James Tooley.
Excellent book.
Which is
on many schools.
Right. The
private many
enormous
schools.
Trend worldwide for low cost, high quality private schools for the poor and everybody else. And
Pretty good brand new book by Lance Azumi on homeschooling.
That's right. A new book by Lance.
Not one of ours, but a good book.
Yeah, I think it's important. And so I think that this case is becoming more accepted, partly because parents are desperate, but it's not just that you can't have face-to-face education, as Bill is pointing out. It's when people see what the schools are teaching and the poor quality of who is a teacher. And this incident in Virginia, that's why it went viral, because people were shocked to see it. And it's spreading because these mothers and fathers, but especially the moms, are not going to put up with this baloney. And they've seen even with the distance learning, what the kids are being taught, and they're not going to put up with it.
I think another thing is, so in connection with the Chicago teachers walking off, some political scientists have pointed out that when you look at opinion polls, parents are very often sympathetic to the teachers' unions. And this is undermining that. So it has a serious long-term effect that a kind of a shell that's been there is cracked.
Yeah, the image of public schooling, of course, was that it was there as a safeguard, especially for the poor, to get the kind of education they need.
And that it's always there. It's like the post office, right? And it's rain or hail or sleet or whatever. Okay, it's raining, but they're not open.
Right.
It's free. And and so I think that the facade, it's like the curtain is being pulled back by Toto, revealing what really the public schools are doing. They're more interested in not working, in teaching CRT and transgenderism, and being paid not to work, and the kids be damned in the process. It's the same thing that people are seeing about the public health establishment and other institutions that progressives are too tone deaf to get over.
It shows us we need little dogs like Toto to pull the curtain back.
That's right.
So to segue just a little bit, but in the same realm of education, there have been calls from U.S. senators, U.S. House of Representative members for Miguel Cordova, the U.S. Secretary of Education, to resign because he or his office may have been the ones that asked the National School Boards Association to write the letter to President Biden that denounced parents as domestic terrorists. And so his office is he's denying it.
Oh, really? But
there's
the evidence looked pretty strong.
Yes.
Well, the evidence is emails amongst the top officials of the National School Boards Association.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody is lying or misrepresenting or not understanding what happened, but it certainly looks problematic, especially if the evidence shows that they did ask for it. And so I mean, this guy is in big trouble if he did instigate that. And of course,
because the point is that it was presented to us initially that the school boards are so concerned that they are appealing to federal authorities.
Spontaneously.
But it turns out the federal authorities may have been inducing them to appeal to the federal authorities.
Yeah,
wow,
that's not good. And it reminds me of a further segue that the Department of Justice has just set up a domestic terrorism unit.
I noticed that.
Mainly probably to target conservatives, ideological conservatives.
Yeah, we need to keep our eyes on that, because whenever the power of the central state gets deployed in that way on ideological grounds, it doesn't. It's not good. It goes one way or the other. It's always bad. It's
a lot of people, including us, were critical of the adoption of the U.S. Patriot Act, not to say that there weren't things that were done inappropriately before that were legal, but the Patriot Act institutionalized and gave a veneer of legality. Right. And we told them that, look out, this could and likely will be used domestically for all sorts of purposes in the guise of fighting terrorism, having nothing to do with it.
Right.
We have a bunch of friends with us, of course, on this episode of Independent Outlook. Some of them are tossing me little comments here and there. One, which I just want to bring in right now and see if you guys have a thought about it. A friend named Terry sends a note in saying, are the teachers' unions really needed for Democratic campaign funding?
Well,
it depends.
I don't know what needed exactly means. They have been a major contributor. They are a major gatekeeper of candidates, and they are a hugely influential interest group within the Democratic Party. Yeah. Is there some other way that funding could replace them? I mean, things always are changing in American politics.
That's for sure.
I think the Democrats would rather, have what they have and build on it rather than have to fill in a hole.
Well, I think Lori Lightfoot's reaction was instructive. I mean, to the left as she is, she decided that she was going to lose ground if she catered to what the unions wanted. So she stood against them for a spell.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's also the Sister Soulia movement moment type of thing, where if the unions get too far egregiously promoting their own perceived interests, sometimes a politician will check them on that just to show that he or she has some independence.
Well, there are plenty of billionaire high-tech people who are left liberal or left liberal, who are putting up big bucks. And it's not a coincidence that what they often support, it actually enables their own particular field to be cartelized and get subsidies and so on. But they do believe in this because that's what they're schooled to believe. But I think
many of them are skeptical of teachers' unions.
That's true. That's right. In fact, many of them are for charter schools,
charters and vouchers.
Right. Okay. So I think it'll be tougher, but it is something that's come into existence that Democrats have benefited from the last 20 years, certainly. But I think Bill is exactly right that the force of the unions, as far as one being viewed as apple pie-ish, and all American.
I think that's over.
I think it's over, and I think
we'll see. They'll try and get it back.
They'll try and get it back. Right. I think the CRT and other aspects of this, are destroying it.
It's just too potent. Yeah. I mean, the usual reaction when you talk about this kind of thing is someone will say in response to this systemic analysis, they'll say, "Well, we have good teachers at our schools and we really like them."
Right.
Yeah. And such teachers.
We have an actual name for this in sort of social psychology, called the retail fallacy, or also called the paradox of proximity. So you always think, oh, the teachers in the school where I put my kid, they're conscientious, they're good. It's problems are elsewhere in the school system. This may be cracking that to some extent. I would say, though, that with regard to critical race theory, it's not really a creature of the teachers' unions. So they have gotten on board, so to speak, although they are among those sometimes that deny that critical race theory is being taught in the schools, which it certainly is.
It certainly is, yeah.
Anyway, so they've, they're linked to it now, and it's going to be tough for them to brush it off. I will congratulate National Review for its recent issue on the 1619 project. So the 1619 project is a project of the New York Times to try to change the history curriculum in the schools, and to say that everything in America is governed by the fact of slavery in our past, and that every aspect of history, every institution, every deed of government, everything is all connected to and governed by and controlled by the existence of slavery. So anyway, the National Review ran several great articles, one by Phil Magnus, in which he debunks the new history of capitalism. And I think he does a great job of showing the facts are wrong about these people. Another is by Wilfred Riley, political scientist. He shows that slavery is not all that important in American history. There are lots of other things going on, that the abolitionists had who were the anti-slavery people of the 19th century. They saw the potential in American political culture, some of them in the Constitution, some in other aspects of American political culture. They were not trying to tear down American society and its political values. And another great article is by Charles Cook. Charles is arguing that the claim of the 1619 project that the Second Amendment, having to do with the right to bear arms, was put in there to put down slave revolts. And he says, no, of course, slave revolts were put down before that. They didn't need that. The Second Amendment had to do with protecting yourself against the tyranny of government. And once Blacks were freed from slavery, it was extremely important for them in combating Ku Klux Klan type terrorism.
That's for sure.
This book by Stephen Halbrook is a systematic follow-up to the same points that Charles Cook is making in the National Review.
And that's an independent institute book.
Yes, it is. And it's an excellent book. And it had an earlier title, was originally the subtitle of this, Freedmen, the 14th Amendment, and the Right to Bear Arms. But anyway, either way you find it, if you're interested in this, it's a great thing.
Before we turn the page,
before you turn the page to turn the page, Steve Halbrook also in his most recent book, The Right to Bear Arms, goes through this and builds upon that earlier book, and shows that the 14th Amendment was primarily pushed and adopted so that Blacks could own guns to defend themselves.
Yeah,
I wanted to add another argument. I wanted to add another thing in the race field, and that is that there's a major figure in American legal history named Homer Plessy. So there was a case called Plessy v. Ferguson, and the decision by the U.S. Supreme Court established separate but equal. Now, Plessy was trying to not have the state enforce a separate streetcar law, and he was suing to stop government from doing that. The companies that ran streetcars and railroads did not want to have to supply separate cars and enforce separate segregation of the races. First of all, they had to put extra cars on the trains. That cost them money. And they just didn't want to be in this business. They just wanted people to ride their cars and get from place to place. So Jennifer Robach Morse has done terrific scholarship on this, and the National Geographic story on the whole issue, on the Plessy being posthumously pardoned, mentions the fact that the streetcar companies and the railroads did not support this, that they helped fund his legal effort. And most of the stories, though, I have to say, never mentioned this.
Yep.
So anyway, it's an important sidebar that business is not pro-racial segregation.
Cuts into their profits. They don't want racial segregation.
Business is trying to serve its customers.
That's why Jim Crow laws had to be passed, because on their own businesses wanted more customers.
Exactly.
And the only way to stop it was to create cartels enforced by the government.
We're going to turn the page to talk about money and inflation, but we have friends with us on the program today on the teachers union business. Here's a couple of fun comments. I appreciate it very much. Jeff notes that something like 25% of the delegates to the 2016 Democratic Convention were members of teacher unions. That's a large percentage of the people at the Democratic National Convention. And then Patsy writes in saying, we assume teachers union represents the teachers. I am a teacher, and I'm pretty sure the teachers union represents the union. Good point, Patsy. Much appreciated.
Well, there's a thing in political sociology called the iron law of oligarchy. And that says that any organization, the politically adept people will take charge and stay in charge. Mm-hmm. It's true of unions, as was discussed by Seymour Martin Lipset in his book, Union Democracy. So I think that goes on, but they're also adapt to the fears and worries of their constituents, because they are afraid that maybe if they don't, someone else will, a new generation or something, will throw out the leaders. And, there's always a person that's going to say, oh, you're kowtowing to the man, you're in league with the bosses. And so the leaders will cater to the fears of their members.
So, okay, changing the subject slightly, before Christmas, Congress passed President Biden's pandemic relief bill, which was a big burst of spending. And then he wanted Congress to pass, of course, his Build Back Better plan. Some people argue who really is a national treasure. I would say that Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia bids fair to be called national treasure, because he announced right before Christmas that he wasn't going to support the Build Back Better thing. No way, no how. And that pretty much was the end of it. And his argument was that there were all sorts of gimmicks that the Biden administration and the Democratic leadership put in the bill to conceal its true costs.
Yes.
There were these programs that were allegedly going to be temporary, but then those very programs were being advertised by the leadership as transformative changes to society, which meant that the goal was not that they'd be temporary, but that they'd be permanent. And he argued that would be a staggering debt of more than $29 trillion was going to be built up by this, and he wasn't going to go for it. And that was the end of that. Will that help us kill the beast of inflation, which would otherwise have been fed even further?
I don't think so, because the inflation we're seeing now, they didn't pass it, right? So yes, there's been lots of government spending, lots and lots, and it's been increasing. And the COVID-related relief, spending in the name of that, it's been monumental. And they monetize the debt. So that's what gives us the money supply that is behind all this when supply chain problems are not leading to it. It's a combination of the two. So we may get some relief from supply chain eventually straightening itself out, but this money is backed up, and it takes a long time for inflation. If they behave themselves, it would take a while for it to go out of the system somehow. So I think we're not off the hook, and certainly Democrats are not going to stop trying to get the spending in pieces.
The Wall Street Journal poses the question, where should the blame lie for U.S. inflation? And I would like to recommend to our friends to take a look at this really remarkable article by our senior fellow, Benjamin Powell, that was published today in Newsweek, and it'll be available on our own website, I think tomorrow. Is that right, David?
Yes.
Ben Powell points out that price controls and government spending will not fix inflation. He points out that we've been down this road before. In 1970s, Richard Nixon tried famously the wage and price controls, which then collapsed on themselves horribly, dogging his steps, those of his successor Ford and successor Carter. It was really a huge mistake. And that's because, according to the analysis from Ben Powell, the underlying reality of how many goods and services are available and how much money is available to spend on them is what really determines the actual economic situation. You can't create a falsehood by somehow pretending that, you can control the prices.
It's the same thing. The balloon is blown up, and to try and squeeze it in various ways, you're just going to, kind of move the balloon around, but you're not going to, you haven't ended inflation by trying to squeeze it into some artificial thing by wage and price control.
Right, exactly.
So Judy Shelton is talking about the need to reduce the Fed's balance sheet and other measures.
And ultimately gold.
That's right. So, and the idea of gold is to bring something that has a market value as opposed to just printing paper, to stabilize prices and stabilize wealth and the debt ratio. We proposed some years ago the idea of liquidating federal assets to do the same thing in many respects. The federal government is one of the largest, wealthiest entities in the entire world, and yet the assets are never valued as part of what should be looked at as far as debt and who owes what. We did a study maybe 10 years ago, which is still very appropriate, that if even if just oil, coal, and gas reserves on public land were essentially put on the market, the value minus extraction costs would pay off the entire national debt.
Wow.
1.5 times.
Wow.
And this doesn't include the continental shelf and whatever.
Right.
So the federal government owns buildings and vehicles and patents and all sorts of stuff. And so that would be another way to deal with this. But Judy's recommendation is a crucial point. But the spending pressure of interest groups and certainly the Washington establishment is very high. But as both you, Bill, and Graham are mentioning, is that there's no way to contain it if you just depend upon inflating the balloon.
Right. It's almost inevitable that it'll be inflated. And if you try and control the inflation by governmentally imposed price controls, that'll backfire. Listen to this great quote from this piece by Ben Powell. He says, using the power of government to limit price increases will do as much long-term good as trying to stop global warming by preventing thermometers from registering higher readings. I think that's a brilliant analogy and pretty darn clever. But so poor President Biden, he's probably feeling kind of desperate at this point. He gave a speech yesterday in Georgia. I think his next place to turn his attention is not going to be Build Back Better, but it's going to be voting. And he came out swinging yesterday, and we can't talk too much longer on this, but he came out swinging yesterday saying that anyone who opposes the federalization of election law in America is essentially implementing Jim Crow 2.0 and is a racist. Did you guys see his comments yesterday? They were pretty potent.
Well, I mean, he opposed the filibuster for decades. So
he supported the filibuster.
He opposed the elimination.
He supported the filibuster for decades. So is that to say that the bulk of his career, he was a racist and a segregationist? Well, for part
A
of
Bull
that time, he
Connor, a
was.
Bull Connor,
Right.
George Wall.
Yeah, that's right. So this is desperate, and he's saying that the having the 50 states have authority over voting measures, which is in the Constitution, is equivalent to having totalitarian states
Yeah,
overrule
he was saying that. Crazy.
voting rights. I mean, it's just so off the deep end.
Off the chart.
It's off the chart. Yeah.
And I think it represents a sense of desperation on his part, because he's looking for, he can't solve the COVID crisis. He can't get his hands around, the inflation and the economy. He can get traction if he brings racial issues into the voting rights question. Maybe he's hoping he gets some traction politically by being as inflammatory as possible. But at what cost? At what cost? And of course, many of his own allies on the left actually boycotted the speech because they said it was too little, too late, and he'd been slow to the party.
Stacey Abrams, right?
Stacey Abrams in particular, and others as well. So we are looking now at a vote coming up in the Senate this month. Senator Schumer, the Democratic leader,
he promised it before Martin Luther King Day, so that's very imminent.
Very imminent. There's allegedly going to be a vote which could kill the filibuster, which would enable the Democratic majority by bare one vote to pass everything it wanted until they lose their majority later this year. And then it would enable the other side to do everything they wanted with just a one vote majority. I think they're into dangerous territory.
So I think we should move on to some of the juicy international things that have happened.
Okay, that'll be our last segment, and we'll let you take the lead.
Judge Sergio Moro in Brazil, who discovered the car wash scandal where oil companies and others were paying politicians to just give them all sorts of special privileges. And the whole system, the middle of the road parties, the conservative parties and the leftist parties were all involved in this. It brought down President Lula. So that judge is now going to run for president, and he has a classical liberal economic program. So
interesting.
The current president, who was not involved in that car wash scandal, but has proven to be somewhat of a disappointment in economic policy. He appointed a good finance minister, but now he's trying to use bread and circuses to buy votes because he sees he's in trouble. So he has been somewhat of a disappointment. He could turn out better, but anyway, this man Moro running, I think, is a good step. Another thing that's going on is all this Ukraine back and forth. I think the most profound insight I saw was that Putin wants to be president for life. He hasn't handled COVID perfectly. He has a very weak economy. He has many domestic problems. The only way he can essentially be a leader and have this position is to busy giddy minds with foreign quarrels, quote Shakespeare, to be a war type president, to be a super patriot president. So I think aside from emotional views, ideological views about Ukraine as another center of Russian civilization and so forth, which he probably also holds and is voiced, I think he's just trying to consolidate his domestic political base here. Meanwhile, all sorts of actors like NATO are scrambling around, and they're doing some provocative things. They're conducting war games in the Black Sea. Ted Gale Carpenter has pointed this out. It's not a good thing to do under these circumstances. Everybody should be de-escalating. And Russia is, of course, doing many provocative things, and the Ukrainians are training to be guerrilla warriors, warriors. I think that's smart on their part. So we'll see how that turns out. It's not, there are easy ways that could go wrong and turn into a World War I type triggering of large conflagration.
And would it be so bad if the United States, President Biden, agreed that having Ukraine in NATO is not a great idea? Would that be so bad?
I'm not I don't see how. Look, I look at it this way. Ukraine used to be part of the Soviet Union. If George Bush Sr. and his aides had had their way, the Soviet Union would have stayed intact. Okay, it's nice that these countries, especially the Baltic countries, were able to get out. It's nice that Ukraine was able to get out. It's not the end of the world. After all, we had NATO. When we had a balance of power when Ukraine was connected to Russia before. I don't favor it for the Ukrainians.
No,
it's horrible for them.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But I don't think it's, puts us in imminent peril, the American people, and I don't think it puts Western Europe in imminent peril.
But also,
I also don't think Ukraine being, sort of skeptical of the Soviet Union really puts Russia in terrible peril. The Russians who are arguing that are making that up. And so, there's a lot of grandstanding going on, but that happens in politics.
Well, I think part of the argument that some Ukrainians are making is if the Ukraine becomes part of NATO. And
right.
So I think that the Ukraine should stay out of NATO.
I think that would be wise.
Yeah, that was my point.
And I think that is the better way to do it. And that would de-escalate, I think, a lot.
But I also don't think there has to be a formal agreement of that. I think the Ukrainians should just step back from that.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
And the U.S. can indicate that they're not necessarily so keen on it right away anyways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that would solve some problems. Well, elsewhere,
I don't know if it would solve them because remember, Putin is trying to solve his domestic problems.
I know. I understood.
And it looks like the Russians are going to leave Kazakhstan. So they went in there.
Good sign.
Yeah.
Well, elsewhere on the international front, on a lighter note, what was this news from about Kim Jong-il that you were telling me about, Bill?
Well, that's pretty funny. It was a very good art. It was covered in a lot of the Western press, but the Daily Mail had a good article on it. So our current leader in North Korea is Kim Jong-un. And his father was Kim Jong-il. And so some years ago when he was alive, he came up with some ideas of wheat wraps. So thin beaten wheat that you put various Korean delicacies in. So cabbage and meat and things like that. And you ate it as a wrapped up thing. Now, he then essentially claimed, and the government in Korea is now claiming, that this is an innovation and no one else had been able to do this. But of course, we have record in Mexico of burritos going back to the early 19th century, and I'm sure they existed long before that. Just we don't have records of it. So it's a bit like, the Russians claiming under Stalin that they invented the automobile and the airplane and all this stuff. It's kind of presumptuous. And the commentators, the specialists on North Korea, view it as further irony is that you can't really buy these burritos, even though they claim they're, breaking all quota records and hugely popular. Actually, you can't buy them. And they don't have even the ingredients because they're having such terrible food problems. But it's actually something the government acknowledges half the time that they're having food problems in North Korea. But other times they claim everyone's happy. So
Kim Jong-il created the burrito. Al Gore invented the internet. Who knows?
Fun with history.
That's right.
We are at the end of our hour. Could
I just say one thing about Joan Didion in passing? So we lost a great writer, Joan Didion, who was from Northern California. She didn't always agree with the views of people like us here at the Independent Institute, but she had cast a cold, clear eye on a lot of U.S. foreign policy adventures. She was extremely candid about the mishaps of the hippie movement and Haight-Ashbury in the 1960s. She had a her essay, Slouching Toward Bethlehem, is a candid picture of kind of the horrors and frightful stupidities of life in the Haight-Ashbury at that time. She wrote a very clear-eyed analysis of feminism for the New York Times Book Review, in which she said that the essence of the doctrine is substituting women for the proletariat in Marxism, and that the thinking of feminist ideologues is a kind of Stalinist repression. So there are not that many people that have general cultural influence like that, and it's a big loss.
Yeah, we miss Joan Didion. May she rest in peace. And let me just from that thank you both for your insights on public affairs today. Thank you, David Theroux. And thank you, Bill Evers. It's always a pleasure to have you and
thank you.
Have all of our friends with us across the various platforms. Thank you for tossing in your comments. I apologize to those people whose interesting input I didn't have a chance to get to, but we invite you to come join us again in a couple of weeks for the next episode of Independent Outlook. Bye-bye from California.